They say power is a shield, but on the night Vivian Ashcombe married Duke Cedric Ravenshade, she learned it could also be a blade pressed against your throat. While champagne flowed and aristocrats danced beneath crystal chandeliers, the man she believed would save her family was already planning its destruction. What she didn't know yet was that her wedding night would become the opening act of a war where love, legacy, and survival would collide in ways that would reshape the very foundations of elite society. This is the story of how a naive heiress became the most dangerous woman in the kingdom. And if you think you know how revenge stories end, stay until the final breath of this tale, because nothing about Vivian Ashcombe's reckoning follows any script you've ever seen. The Ravenshade estate sprawled across the eastern hills like a monument to accumulated centuries of blood and ambition. Vivian stood in the marble-floored entrance hall, wedding dress pooling around her feet like spilled milk, and realized she had made a catastrophic mistake. The realization didn't arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a slow poison seeping through her consciousness, starting from the moment she saw Cedric's face when he thought no one was watching. He stood near the grand staircase talking to Lord Pembroke, his best man, and his expression held none of the warmth he'd shown her during their courtship. Instead, his features carried the flat calculation of a man inspecting livestock he'd just purchased. Vivian felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture that would eventually split her entire world in half. The wedding had been perfect, too perfect, the kind of perfection that only money and meticulous planning could produce. White roses imported from the southern provinces, a chamber orchestra playing compositions commissioned specifically for the occasion, guest lists that read like a directory of everyone who mattered in the kingdom's power structure. Her father would have loved it, would have stood beside her with that proud smile he always wore when discussing business deals that expanded the Ashcombe merchant empire. But father was 6 months dead, his body barely cold in the family mausoleum before Vivian found herself facing financial predators circling the inheritance he'd left behind. Cedric had appeared like salvation itself, handsome, titled, politically connected, and seemingly genuinely interested in the frightened young woman struggling to navigate a world of vultures and vipers. What a beautiful lie that had been. Vivian watched Cedric's mouth move as he spoke to Pembroke. She couldn't hear the words from this distance, but she saw Pembroke laugh and clap Cedric on the shoulder. Saw the way Cedric's eyes flicked toward her for just a moment, assessing, then dismissed her entirely as he turned back to his conversation. Like she was a task he'd completed and could now ignore. Her hands trembled. She pressed them against the silk of her dress, feeling the expensive fabric bunch under her fingers. 200 guests still moved through the estate, drinking Cedric's wine and eating from tables laden with enough food to feed a village for a month. The celebration would continue for hours yet, and she was expected to smile through all of it. A servant passed carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Vivian took one, her third of the evening, and the alcohol burned down her throat like clarity itself. She had signed the marriage documents 3 hours ago. Her signature in black ink, his beside it, witnesses attesting that Vivian Ashcombe had legally become Vivian Ravenshade, that every asset her father had built over 30 years of ruthless business acumen now fell under her husband's control, according to the laws governing noble marriages. Cedric had explained it all very carefully during their engagement, his voice soothing as he assured her it was merely a formality, that he would never dream of interfering with her management of the Ashcombe holdings. Another lie. She could see that now with the horrible clarity that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself. Movement caught her eye. A woman ascending the grand staircase, her burgundy dress cut in a style just provocative enough to toe the line of scandal. Vivian didn't recognize her from the guest list, but something about the way she moved, the confidence in her stride, the intimate knowledge of the estate's layout as she disappeared down the second-floor corridor made Vivian's stomach twist. She set down her champagne glass and followed. The second floor was quieter, most guests remaining in the ballroom or on the garden terrace, where the night air carried the scent of jasmine and expensive tobacco. Vivian's heels clicked against marble, then muffled as she reached the carpeted hallway leading to the private family wing. She shouldn't be up here. Even as Cedric's wife, she understood instinctively that certain spaces in this house were not meant for her, but she kept walking. The woman in burgundy stood outside a door halfway down the hall. She knocked twice, soft and familiar, and the door opened immediately. Vivian pressed herself against the wall, hidden by the shadows of an alcove, and watched Cedric pull the woman inside with an urgency that made everything suddenly, violently clear. The door closed. Vivian stood frozen in the shadows, her wedding dress a ghostly white in the dim hallway, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. Not just heartbreak. Heartbreak was too small, too simple a word for what she felt. This was the death of a person she'd been and the terrible birth of someone new. She walked back downstairs in a daze, her face a mask of pleasant emptiness. No one noticed. Why would they? She was just the new Duchess, pretty and young and utterly irrelevant, except as a vessel for transferring wealth from one name to another. The night continued. Dancing and laughter and congratulations from people who thought they were witnessing a love match. Vivian smiled until her face hurt. She accepted embraces from women who would gossip about her tomorrow. She made small talk with men who'd tried to court her themselves and now calculated how to use her new position to their advantage. And through it all, she watched Cedric work the room like the political animal he was. Shaking hands, making promises, building alliances. He returned to her side periodically, playing his role with the same skills she was learning to employ. His hand on her waist felt like a brand. His kiss on her cheek, delivered for the audience of their guests, made her skin crawl. Near midnight, as the party began to thin, Cedric's mother approached. Duchess Eleanor Ravenshade was a woman carved from ice and ambition, her beauty preserved through sheer force of will and expensive treatments. She studied Vivian with eyes that saw too much. "You look pale, dear. Wedding night nerves?" Vivian manufactured a shy smile. "Perhaps. Everything feels rather overwhelming." Eleanor's mouth curved in something that might have been sympathy if you didn't look too closely. "Marriage is overwhelming, especially when you're marrying above your station, but you'll learn. The Ravenshade women always do." The casual cruelty of it took Vivian's breath away. Above your station, as if her family's wealth meant nothing without a title attached, as if she should be grateful to be here, should accept whatever scraps of dignity they chose to grant her. "I'm sure I'll adapt quickly," Vivian said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "I've always been a fast learner." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, some instinct warning her that this wasn't quite the response she'd expected. But before she could reply, Cedric materialized at Vivian's elbow. "Mother, I hope you're not tiring out my bride." He smiled, all charm and filial warmth, simply welcoming her to the family. Eleanor patted Vivian's hand with fingers cold as stone. "You've chosen well, Cedric. She has your father's coloring. Same brown hair, same delicate frame. How fitting." The comment landed like a slap. Vivian saw the flash of irritation cross Cedric's face before he buried it. Saw Eleanor's satisfied smirk as she glided away. Apparently she'd just been compared to Cedric's father, a man whose portrait hung in the library depicting someone who looked nothing like Vivian at all. It was an insult, a deliberate one, and neither of them was going to acknowledge it. "You look tired," Cedric said, his hand firm on her lower back. "Perhaps we should retire." Vivian wanted to refuse, wanted to stand in this ballroom surrounded by witnesses for the rest of the night if it meant delaying what came next. But she saw the calculation in his eyes and understood that refusal would create a scene, would mark her as difficult, would give him ammunition to use against her later. So she nodded and let him guide her up the grand staircase while remaining guests murmured approving comments about newlywed eagerness. The master bedroom was decorated in deep blues and gold, masculine and imposing. Cedric closed the door behind them and immediately crossed to the sideboard to pour himself a whiskey. He didn't offer her any. Vivian stood in the center of the room, still wearing her wedding dress, and waited. Cedric drank half his glass in one swallow, then turned to face her. The mask of charm had fallen away completely now that they were alone. What remained was something harder, more calculating. "You played your part well tonight." He studied her over the rim of his glass. "Very convincing performance." Performance. The word hung in the air between them like poison gas. "I could say the same about you," Vivian replied quietly. His eyebrows rose. "Could you?" "You had that woman here. Tonight. During our wedding." Cedric's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked faintly amused. "Ah, you noticed that." The casual admission was worse than any denial. Vivian felt her hands curl into fists, nails digging into her palms. "Who is she?" "Someone who understands her place." He finished his whiskey and set down the glass with careful precision. Unlike you, apparently. My place, Vivian repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. You married me 6 hours ago. Cedric laughed. Actually laughed. The sound ugly in the expensive room. I married your fortune 6 hours ago. Let's not confuse the matter with sentiment. Your father built something remarkable, I'll give him that. A merchant empire large enough to rival some noble houses. But without a title, without political connections, it was vulnerable. You were vulnerable. And here I am, your savior, your husband, your protector. He moved toward her, and Vivian held her ground, though every instinct screamed to retreat. You needed me, Vivian. You were desperate. All those creditors circling, all those business partners threatening to pull their investments when they realized a 22-year-old girl was trying to run her dead father's company. You would have lost everything within a year. I saved you from that. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with false tenderness. All I ask in return is that you play your role. Smile at parties. Bear my children eventually. Don't make trouble. It's not much to ask, considering what I've given you. Vivian stared at him and felt ice crystallize around her heart. What you've given me. Position, protection, the Ravenshade name. Do you have any idea what that's worth? And what did you take in return? Cedric's smile was sharp as a knife. Everything that matters. The business contracts are already being renegotiated with my people. The property deeds will transfer within the month. Your father's political allies are now my political allies. Even this wedding was strategic, positioning me as a man who values traditional merchant families, which plays well with the commercial faction in Parliament. He stepped back, studying her like an art dealer evaluating a painting's worth. You thought this was a love story. How charmingly naive. This was a merger, Vivian. I acquired assets. You acquired a title and the illusion of security. We both got what we truly needed. The room spun. Vivian reached out and gripped the bedpost, needing something solid to anchor herself. Every conversation during their courtship suddenly replayed in her mind with new context. The way he'd asked about her father's business holdings while pretending casual interest. His strategic introductions to his mother and the other Ravenshade family members. Ensuring she'd feel obligated to accept his proposal when it came. The rushed timeline, pushing for marriage barely 6 months after her father's death, when she was still grieving and vulnerable. It had all been calculated, every smile, every touch, every whispered promise. He'd hunted her like prey, and she'd walked straight into the trap because she was scared and alone and desperate to believe someone could actually want her for herself. The woman upstairs, Vivian heard herself say. The one you were with during our wedding reception. What's her name? Cedric considered this question as if deciding whether to grant her this small piece of information. Isabel Cormont. She's been my companion for 3 years. 3 years? Vivian's laugh came out broken. You kept a mistress while courting me. I kept a relationship with someone I actually care about while conducting business with you. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if the distinction was obvious and reasonable. Isabel understands what we have. She doesn't make demands or create drama. Unlike you, apparently, who seems determined to be difficult about this. Difficult. He had destroyed every illusion she'd built, shattered her heart, and her sense of self. And he called her difficult for having the audacity to be hurt by it. Vivian straightened, releasing her grip on the bedpost. Her wedding dress suddenly felt like a costume, an elaborate lie rendered in silk and lace. When she spoke, her voice came out steady, cold, utterly unlike the frightened girl who'd walked up the aisle that afternoon. I won't share you. Cedric's expression hardened. You don't have a choice. Actually, I do. Vivian moved toward the door. I can leave. He was on her in 3 strides, his hand closing around her wrist hard enough to bruise. She gasped, more from shock than pain, and found herself spun around to face him. The charming facade had crumbled completely now, revealing the ruthless ambition beneath. You can't leave. We're married. Your assets are legally mine. If you walk out that door, you do so with nothing. No money, no property, no family name to leverage because your precious father is dead and left no one but you. You'd be destitute within weeks. Is that what you want? His grip tightened. Let me paint you a picture of your options, wife. You stay here, play your role, and maintain the dignity and comfort your position provides. Or you leave and spend the rest of your life scrambling for survival while watching me turn your father's legacy into something greater under my control. Because that business is mine now. Those holdings, those investments, those carefully cultivated relationships, all mine. And I'm very good at what I do. Vivian met his eyes and saw no humanity there, just calculation and cold satisfaction. This was who he'd been all along. She'd just been too desperate to see it. I understand, she said quietly. Good. Cedric released her wrist and stepped back, smoothing down his jacket, as if the confrontation had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I'll sleep in my study tonight. Give us both time to adjust to our new reality. But starting tomorrow, we maintain appearances. We're the happy newlyweds everyone expects us to be. Are we clear? Vivian nodded, not trusting her voice. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, I don't hate you, Vivian. You're just collateral in a much larger game. If you're smart, you'll learn to find your own advantages within this arrangement. God knows there are worse fates than being a duchess. Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the master bedroom of a house that would never be her home. Vivian stood motionless for a long moment, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Then very slowly, she walked to the window and looked out at the estate grounds. Lanterns still glowed on the garden paths where the last lingering guests wandered, drunk and happy, celebrating what they thought was a romantic union. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the frightened girl who'd married Duke Cedric Ravenshade that afternoon was gone. In her place stood something new, something forged in betrayal and burning with a cold, focused rage that would take months to fully emerge but had just been born in this moment. Vivian Ashcombe, now Ravenshade, would play her role. She would smile and curtsy and attend parties and let everyone believe she was the dutiful, grateful wife of a powerful duke. But behind that mask, she would be watching, learning, gathering ammunition. Because Cedric had made a critical mistake. He'd assumed his victory was complete, that she would accept her fate and fade into comfortable irrelevance. He'd underestimated the intelligence that had allowed her father to build an empire from nothing, the same ruthlessness that ran in her blood. She turned from the window and began the painstaking process of removing her wedding dress, each button and hook a small act of methodical precision. The dress fell to the floor in a pool of white silk, and she stepped out of it without looking back. Tomorrow would require a different costume, a different performance. And unlike Cedric, when Vivian Ashcombe played a role, she played it to absolute perfection. Bam. The next morning arrived gray and cold, autumn rain streaking the tall windows of the breakfast room. Vivian sat at the long mahogany table, dressed in a pale blue morning gown that made her look younger and more innocent than she felt. She'd chosen it deliberately, the same way she'd chosen the subtle redness around her eyes that suggested tears rather than sleeplessness. Cedric entered exactly 15 minutes after she'd been served, his timing precise as always. He looked refreshed, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and aristocratic bearing. No trace of last night's confrontation showed on his face. Good morning. He took a seat at the head of the table, accepting coffee from a servant with barely a glance. Did you sleep well? As well as could be expected. Vivian kept her voice soft, slightly wounded. She saw his eyes assess her, cataloging her appearance and demeanor, calculating whether she'd absorbed last night's lesson or would require further correction. We have several social obligations this week, he said, unfolding his newspaper. The Pembroke Garden Party on Wednesday. Lady Ashford's charity luncheon Friday. And Saturday evening, we're expected at the Royal Autumn Gala. Vivian nodded, spreading jam on toast she had no intention of eating. I'll make sure I'm appropriately dressed for each occasion. See that you are. My mother will accompany you to the modiste this afternoon. She has strong opinions about what constitutes appropriate dress for Ravenshade women. Of course. Vivian took a small bite of toast, chewed, swallowed. Will Isabel be attending any of these events? The newspaper rustled slightly. That's not your concern. I'd simply like to know how to navigate social situations appropriately. Vivian kept her tone reasonable, even helpful. If she'll be present, I should understand the dynamics to avoid any awkwardness that might reflect poorly on you. Cedric lowered the paper enough to study her face. After a long moment, he said, Isabel understands her position. She won't cause you embarrassment in public, but she will be present, occasionally. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Are we going to have this fight every morning? I'm not fighting. Vivian met his eyes steadily. I'm simply trying to understand the rules of the game you've placed me in. You made it clear last night that I'm expected to maintain appearances. I'm asking for the information necessary to do that successfully. She watched him wrestle with it, saw the moment he decided her compliance was genuine rather than strategic. Good. Let him believe she'd surrendered. Let him think her intelligent enough to recognize her powerlessness, but too broken to do anything about it. Isabel will maintain discretion, he said finally. In public, she's simply an acquaintance from an old family. Any other arrangements are private matters. I understand. Vivian returned her attention to her toast. Thank you for clarifying. The conversation ended there, both of them eating in silence, punctuated only by the clink of silverware and the rustle of Cedric's newspaper. To any servant observing, they looked like a typical aristocratic couple, comfortable in their morning routine. Vivian let the silence stretch, using the time to study her husband when his attention was elsewhere. He was handsome, she acknowledged clinically. Strong features, dark hair swept back from a high forehead, the kind of commanding presence that drew eyes in any gathering. She'd been so dazzled by that presence during their courtship, so desperate to believe the pretty lies he spun. Never again. After breakfast, Eleanor Ravenshade arrived in a carriage that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. The Dowager Duchess swept into the entrance hall like a force of nature, her steel gray dress perfectly tailored, her posture suggesting she'd never experienced a moment of doubt in her entire life. Vivian, dear, time to transform you into something appropriate for your new station. She looked Vivian up and down with the same critical assessment a horse breeder might use on questionable stock. That dress is passable, but lacks sophistication. We'll need to completely overhaul your wardrobe. Vivian smiled and gathered her cloak. I'm grateful for your guidance, Mother Eleanor. I know I have much to learn about society expectations. Eleanor's expression softened marginally, apparently pleased by Vivian's deference. At least you recognize your deficiencies. That's more self-awareness than most merchant daughters possess. They settled into this carriage, and as it rolled through rain-slicked streets toward the fashionable district, Eleanor launched into what would become a 2-hour lecture on the intricate rules governing aristocratic women's behavior. What colors were appropriate for different occasions? Which jewels could be worn during mourning periods versus celebrations? The precise depth of curtsy required for various ranks of nobility. Vivian absorbed it all, asking intelligent questions, taking mental notes. Every scrap of information was ammunition. Every rule Eleanor taught her was a potential weapon once she understood how to use it. The modiste shop was a temple to expensive fabric and delicate craftsmanship. Madame Severin, a hawk-faced woman with fingers stained from years of pinning silk, greeted Eleanor with the warmth reserved for customers who spent fortunes without questioning prices. Duchess Eleanor, what a pleasure. And this must be the new Lady Ravenshade. Madame Severin circled Vivian slowly, eyes calculating measurements. Lovely bone structure, though we'll need corsetry to create a more fashionable silhouette. For the next 3 hours, Vivian was measured, pinned, and dressed in fabric samples, while Eleanor and Madame Severin discussed her body as if she weren't present. Her hips were too wide, her bust too modest, her shoulders too square. Each criticism was delivered with clinical detachment, as if they were discussing carpentry problems rather than commenting on another human being's physical form. Vivian stood silent through it all, letting the barbs roll off her like rain on glass. She'd learned last night that emotional reactions were vulnerability, and she would not give these women the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Eleanor ordered 30 dresses, morning gowns, afternoon dresses, evening gowns, riding habits, walking ensembles. Each one cost more than some families earned in a month. Each one was designed to transform Vivian into the perfect Ravenshade wife, elegant, refined, utterly forgettable. As they returned to the carriage, packages following in a second vehicle, Eleanor patted Vivian's hand. You did well today. No complaints, no dramatic reactions. Perhaps you'll adapt to this life after all. I'm determined to do my husband proud, Vivian replied, the lie smooth as silk. That evening, she dressed for dinner in one of her new purchases, a dove-gray gown that made her skin look porcelain pale. She styled her hair the way Eleanor had suggested, swept up in an elaborate arrangement that emphasized her slender neck. When she examined herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Perfect. She looked exactly like what they wanted her to be. Beautiful, refined, empty. Dinner was a formal affair. Cedric's younger brother Marcus attended, a charming wastrel who spent most of his inheritance on horses and gambling. Also present was Lord Adrian Vale, one of Cedric's political rivals, invited as part of some complicated social chess move Vivian didn't yet understand. Adrian was perhaps 5 years older than Cedric, his features more angular, his manner more sardonic. He watched the table dynamics with sharp intelligence, missing nothing. When introduced to Vivian, he'd bowed over her hand and murmured congratulations that sounded almost sympathetic. Now, over the third course, he addressed her directly. "Lady Vivian, your father was a remarkable man. I had the pleasure of conducting business with him several times. His loss must be devastating for you." "It was," Vivian said quietly. "He taught me everything about the business. I miss his wisdom daily." Marcus laughed, already on his fourth glass of wine. "Surely you didn't actually work with the business, did you? I thought merchant fathers kept their daughters occupied with needlework and piano. My father believed in preparing me to manage the family holdings." Vivian kept her voice gentle, even as she corrected him. "I attended business meetings from the time I was 16, learned contract negotiation, investment strategy, personnel management." "How progressive," Adrian said, his tone suggesting genuine interest. "And now you're married to Cedric, whose business acumen is legendary in its own right. I imagine the two of you make quite the formidable team." Cedric's knife scraped against his plate, the sound sharp in the elegant dining room. "Vivian handles social obligations now. The business concerns are my domain." "Of course." Adrian's smile never wavered, but Vivian caught the flash of calculation in his eyes. He'd just learned something useful about the power dynamics in this marriage. Still, what a waste of education and talent. Your father must have spent considerable resources training you. "He did." Vivian met Adrian's gaze steadily. "I hope to honor that investment eventually, in whatever way my new position allows." The conversation moved on to politics, hunting, the latest scandal involving an earl and his secretary. Vivian ate mechanically, contributed comments when expected, played her role. But she felt Adrian's attention returning to her periodically, assessing, curious. When the evening ended and guests departed, Cedric cornered her in the hallway. "What were you doing?" Vivian blinked innocently. "I'm sorry?" With Adrian, all that talk about business knowledge and investment strategy. "He's one of my political enemies, Vivian. You don't offer him ammunition to use against me." I was answering his questions politely. "Isn't that what you wanted? For me to be charming at dinner parties?" "Charming, yes. Strategic, no." Cedric stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Adrian Vale is dangerous. He's been trying to undermine my position in Parliament for years. If he thinks he can use you as a tool against me, he will. Then perhaps you should tell me who your enemies are so I can navigate appropriately." Vivian held her ground. "You keep demanding I play this game perfectly while refusing to explain the rules. The rule is simple. You represent me. Every word you speak reflects on my reputation and political standing. Keep your mouth shut unless you're saying something completely neutral, and we'll get along fine." He turned and strode away, leaving Vivian in the dimly lit hallway. She waited until his footsteps faded, then allowed herself a small, cold smile. Adrian Vale was Cedric's enemy, which meant Adrian Vale might eventually prove useful. The weeks that followed established a routine that was both suffocating and oddly useful. Vivian played the perfect duchess during the day, attending social obligations, learning the intricate dance of aristocratic politics, observing everything while appearing to notice nothing important. At night, she retreated to the master bedroom alone while Cedric disappeared to God knows where, probably Isabel's apartments in the city. She didn't ask, didn't complain. Maintained the facade so perfectly that even Eleanor began to make approving comments about her adjustment. But in the quiet hours when the house slept, Vivian studied. She'd discovered that the Ravenshade Library contained not just literature and philosophy, but also decades of business records, political correspondence, and family documents. Cedric apparently assumed she was too stupid or too broken to investigate, because he'd never bothered to restrict her access. His first mistake in what would become a long series. She learned that the Ravenshade fortune, while considerable, was not as secure as appearances suggested. Cedric had invested heavily in several risky political ventures, betting on appointments and policy changes that hadn't materialized. He'd borrowed against the estate to finance his position in Parliament, maintaining the appearance of wealth while operating on increasingly thin margins. Her father's business holdings were supposed to solve that problem. The Ashcombe companies were profitable, well-managed, built on solid foundations rather than aristocratic arrogance. Cedric planned to strip them for parts, selling off properties and contracts to pay his debts, while keeping enough to maintain the fiction of legitimate merger. Vivian memorized every document, every debt, every obligation, and late at night she began making lists. It was during one of these midnight research sessions that she heard voices in the hallway outside the library. Male voices, drunk and careless. She extinguished her candle and pressed herself into the shadows behind a tall bookshelf. The library door opened and two figures stumbled inside. Cedric and Marcus, both reeking of whiskey and cigars. "Swear to God, brother, you're a genius." Marcus collapsed into a leather chair, laughing. "Married that merchant girl for her money and still get to keep your mistress. It's perfect." "Not so loud." Even drunk, Cedric had enough sense to lower his voice. "The servants talk. Let them talk. Who cares?" Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "You got everything you wanted, the business, the political leverage, and you didn't even have to pretend to love her after the wedding night. Did you see her face at dinner tonight when Adrian was flirting? Thought she might actually cry. Adrian's becoming a problem." Cedric moved to the sideboard and poured himself another drink. "He suspects the marriage isn't what it appears. So what? Everyone marries for advantage. It's practically aristocratic tradition." "Yes, but I presented this as a love match, the merchant prince's daughter and the noble duke, a perfect union of old money and new ambition. Adrian knows me too well. If he figures out I'm already asset-stripping her father's companies, he'll expose it in Parliament and paint me as a predator. Aren't you?" Marcus laughed again, the sound ugly. "Come on, Cedric. You seduced a grieving girl, married her before she recovered from her father's death, and immediately started dismantling everything the old man built. That's textbook predatory." Vivian's hands trembled. She pressed them flat against the bookshelf, focusing on the cool wood beneath her palms to anchor herself. "It's business," Cedric said coldly. "Her father built an impressive empire, I'll grant him that, but he had no sons, no brothers, no male heir capable of maintaining it. Vivian's smart enough for a woman, but she has no idea how to navigate aristocratic politics or manage relationships with the kind of men who control real power. The business would have collapsed within 2 years under her control." "So you're her savior?" Marcus's tone was mocking. "In a way, yes." Cedric drained his glass. "She gets to keep the Duchess title and live in comfort. That's more than most merchant daughters could dream of. The fact that I'm repurposing her inheritance to secure my political position is simply practical redistribution of resources. And Isabel doesn't mind. Isabel understands reality. She knows I needed this marriage for political and financial reasons. Once I've secured the assets and established my position, things will return to normal." "Normal meaning you and Isabel while your wife sits home embroidering or whatever useless activities duchesses do?" "Exactly." Cedric set down his glass with finality. "Vivian will adapt. She has no choice. I control everything now. Her money, her property, even her social standing. If she tries to leave or make trouble, I'll destroy what's left of her father's reputation so completely that no one in aristocratic society will acknowledge her existence." "Seems harsh," Marcus said, though he didn't sound particularly bothered by it. "It's necessary. Can't have her thinking she has any leverage. Women in her position need to understand their place quickly, or they cause problems for years." They continued talking, but Vivian had heard enough. She remained frozen in her hiding place, barely breathing, until both men eventually stumbled out to find their beds. When the house was silent again, Vivian moved to the window and stared out at the grounds. Frost was forming on the grass, glittering in the moonlight like scattered diamonds. Beautiful and cold and sharp enough to cut. She pressed her forehead against the glass and let the rage burn through her. Not the hot, explosive anger that would make her do something stupid, but cold fury that settled into her bones and crystallized into absolute certainty. Cedric thought she was helpless, thought she'd accepted her fate, thought he'd won completely and permanently. He had no idea what he'd actually created. Vivian returned to the desk and opened one of the ledgers she'd been studying, found the entries showing Cedric's debt to Lord Pembroke, the same Pembroke who'd been his best man at the wedding, who apparently held leverage over Cedric significant enough to require careful management. She began taking notes in a cipher she'd developed, disguising her handwriting, keeping records of everything that might eventually matter: debts, political alliances, secret agreements, weaknesses. By the time dawn light crept through the library windows, Vivian had the foundation of a plan. Nothing concrete yet, nothing she could act on immediately, but the shape of something emerging from the darkness of her situation. She closed the ledgers and returned them to their exact positions on the shelves, smoothed her dress, and checked her reflection in a decorative mirror, making sure she looked composed rather than devastated. Then she went upstairs to dress for breakfast, and another day of playing the obedient wife who'd accepted her powerlessness. Because that's what prey does before it realizes it's actually the predator. 3 months into the marriage, Vivian received an unexpected invitation. Lady Catherine Pemberton, one of the most influential women in aristocratic society, was hosting an intimate gathering for a select group of noble women to discuss a charity initiative. Vivian's presence was specifically requested. Eleanor seemed pleased. Catherine rarely invites new brides into her inner circle. This is an excellent opportunity for you to establish yourself properly. Vivian arrived at the Pemberton townhouse on a gray afternoon, dressed in a burgundy gown that struck the perfect balance between elegant and understated. The gathering included 12 women, all from powerful families, all assessing her with the predatory interest aristocrats reserved for potential prey or allies. Lady Catherine was perhaps 60, her beauty maintained through expensive treatments and rigid self-discipline. She greeted Vivian warmly enough, though her eyes held the same calculating interest as everyone else's. "My dear Lady Ravenshade, how delightful that you could join us. We've all been so curious about Cedric's merchant bride." The slight emphasis on merchant was deliberate. Vivian smiled and executed a perfect curtsy. "I'm honored by the invitation, Lady Catherine, and grateful for the opportunity to contribute to worthy causes." They settled into the drawing room where tea and delicate pastries were served on china that probably cost more than most people's annual income. The conversation started with charity work, discussing fundraising strategies for hospitals and orphanages. Vivian contributed thoughtful comments, careful not to overshadow anyone while still demonstrating intelligence. But as the afternoon wore on, the conversation shifted, became more personal, more vicious. The women began dissecting other noble women who weren't present, picking apart marriages, affairs, scandals with surgical precision. "Did you hear about the Ashford girl?" Lady Margaret said, her voice dripping false sympathy. "Apparently her husband found her too tiresome and sent her to their country estate indefinitely. She hasn't been seen in society for 6 months. How unfortunate," another woman murmured, though her tone suggested she found it entertaining rather than sad. "Marriage can be quite challenging," Lady Catherine said, her gaze sliding to Vivian, "especially when expectations don't align with reality. Don't you agree, Lady Ravenshade?" The room went quiet. All eyes turned to Vivian, waiting to see how she'd respond. This was a test. They all knew, or suspected, that her marriage wasn't the love match it had been presented as. Now they wanted to see if she'd break under gentle interrogation. Vivian set down her teacup with perfect composure. "Marriage is certainly an education. I'm learning daily about society expectations and the complexity of aristocratic relationships." "How diplomatic," Lady Margaret said. "Your merchant background must make some adjustments particularly difficult." There it was, the direct attack disguised as polite conversation. "Actually," Vivian said slowly, "I find the business skills my father taught me translate surprisingly well. Managing a household is not so different from managing a company. Both require resource allocation, personnel management, and strategic thinking." She paused, then added with careful deliberation, "Though I confess, aristocratic social dynamics involve a level of subterfuge I'm still mastering. In business, betrayals are at least direct. In society, they're wrapped in silk and delivered with a smile." Several women shifted uncomfortably. Lady Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. Vivian continued, her voice soft but clear. "For instance, discovering your husband maintains a mistress is apparently such common practice among nobility that mentioning it is considered gauche. Whereas in merchant families, such behavior would be grounds for immediate scandal. The difference in expectations is quite fascinating from an anthropological perspective." The silence that followed was absolute. Vivian had just acknowledged the unspoken reality of her marriage while simultaneously insulting the aristocratic tolerance for male infidelity. It was social suicide by any conventional measure, But instead of condemnation, she saw something else in several women's eyes: recognition, understanding, even respect. Lady Catherine began to laugh. It started as a chuckle and built into genuine amusement. Well, perhaps you're adjusting better than any of us expected. The tension broke. Other women began to smile, then joined the laughter. Vivian had passed the test by refusing to pretend, by acknowledging reality with enough sharp intelligence that even these predatory women had to respect it. The conversation shifted again, becoming more real. Women began sharing their own stories of difficult marriages, strategic survival, the unspoken bargains that governed their lives. It wasn't quite friendship, but it was something closer to honesty than Vivian had expected. As the gathering ended, Lady Catherine pulled Vivian aside. "You're smarter than you look, my dear. Dangerous quality in a duchess." "Is it?" Vivian met her eyes steadily. "Depends whether you use it wisely." Catherine's smile was sharp. "Your husband has powerful friends, but he also has powerful enemies. The wise course is to remain neutral and protect yourself. And if neutrality isn't an option, then make sure you're stronger than whoever attacks first." Catherine patted her hand almost fondly. "Welcome to the game, Lady Ravenshade. Try not to get destroyed too quickly. The interesting players are always in short supply." Vivian left the gathering with her mind racing. The afternoon had revealed something important. These aristocratic women weren't her enemies. Many of them were trapped in similar circumstances, playing similar games of survival and strategic adaptation. Some of them might even become allies if approached correctly. She returned to the Ravenshade estate to find Cedric in his study, papers spread across his desk. He looked up as she entered, his expression impatient. "Where were you?" "Lady Catherine's charity gathering." Vivian removed her gloves slowly. "Your mother mentioned it was important I attend." "And? What did you discuss?" "Orphanages, hospital fundraising, the usual charitable concerns." Cedric studied her for a long moment, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. Vivian met his gaze with perfect innocence, giving him nothing to question. Finally, he grunted and returned to his papers. "Fine. Dinner is at 8. Try not to be late." Vivian went upstairs to change, her mind already categorizing the afternoon's information. Lady Catherine was connected to powerful political figures, including several of Cedric's rivals. Lady Margaret's husband was a financial investor with interests that overlapped some of her father's former business holdings. These relationships could be cultivated, information could be gathered. The foundation of her plan was starting to solidify. That night at dinner, Cedric was distracted, barely speaking except to grunt responses to her polite conversational attempts. Vivian ate in silence, watching him, cataloging his tension and preoccupation. Near the end of the meal, he suddenly spoke. "I'm traveling to the capital next week. Parliament session. I'll be gone approximately 2 months." Vivian looked up, careful to keep her expression neutral. "I see. Should I prepare to accompany you?" "No. You'll remain here. My mother will manage the household and ensure you don't cause any problems in my absence." "Of course." Vivian returned her attention to her plate, but inside her mind was racing. 2 months. 2 months without Cedric's constant supervision. 2 months to investigate more thoroughly, to build relationships, to position pieces on the board. She'd learned one critical lesson over these past 3 months. Patience was its own kind of weapon. Cedric thought he'd broken her, thought she'd surrendered completely. He'd stopped watching her as closely, stopped treating her as any kind of threat. His second mistake, following the first of leaving her access to his private records. How many more mistakes would he make before he realized the magnitude of his error? Vivian smiled softly and thanked the servant who cleared her plate. She looked like the perfect image of a dutiful wife, grateful for her husband's guidance, accepting of her limited role. And beneath that surface, something cold and sharp and absolutely merciless was taking shape. Cedric left for the capital 3 days later, his departure marked by perfunctory kisses on her cheek and warnings to behave herself in his absence. Vivian stood on the steps, waving goodbye as his carriage disappeared down the tree-lined drive. Then she turned and walked back into the house wearing an expression Eleanor would later describe as worryingly thoughtful. The game was beginning in earnest. And this time, Vivian Ashcombe Ravenshade would be the one writing the rules. She waited exactly 1 week after Cedric's departure before making her first real move. long enough that the household staff would settle back into normal routines, short enough that Eleanor wouldn't become suspicious of her sudden initiative. The move itself was subtle. Vivian requested a meeting with Harrison, her father's former business manager who'd been retained to handle the transition of Ashcombe Holdings. Cedric had kept him on, apparently believing the man's loyalty would transfer automatically with the marriage contracts. Cedric's third mistake. Harrison arrived at the estate looking tired and considerably older than when Vivian had last seen him. They met in the small drawing room, tea served, and servants dismissed. Vivian waited until the door closed before speaking. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Harrison." "Lady Vivian." He hesitated. "Lady Ravenshade, I should say. Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you." Vivian poured tea with steady hands, though I wonder if congratulations are what either of us feels is appropriate. Harrison's expression flickered. "I'm not sure I understand." "Don't you?" Vivian met his eyes directly. "My father trusted you completely, trained you personally, built his empire with you as his right hand, and now you're watching his life's work be dismantled piece by piece while pretending not to notice." The silence stretched between them. Harrison's hands tightened around his teacup. "The marriage contract was legal," he said finally. "The holdings transferred appropriately. I have no grounds to contest any decisions Lord Ravenshade makes regarding the companies." "Legally, no." Vivian set down her teacup. "But morally? Tell me, Mr. Harrison, what would my father think of what's happening?" His face crumpled slightly. "Your father would be devastated, apoplectic. He'd never have agreed to this marriage if he'd known. But he's dead, and I was desperate and stupid and believed pretty lies from a man who never intended to honor any of them." Vivian's voice hardened. "So here we are. My husband is systematically destroying everything my father built, and you're helping him do it. What choice do I have?" Harrison's voice rose, desperate. "Lord Ravenshade controls everything now. If I refuse to cooperate, he'll simply replace me with someone less knowledgeable, and the damage will be even worse." "You're right." Vivian stood and moved to the window, looking out at gardens beginning to wake from winter dormancy. "You have no legal recourse, no way to stop him through conventional channels." She turned back to face him. "But information is its own kind of power, Mr. Harrison, and I find myself very curious about the details of how my inheritance is being managed." Harrison studied her, seeing something in her expression that made him straighten in his chair. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing nothing." Vivian's smile was cold. "I'm simply noting that as the legal wife, I have a right to be informed about business matters affecting my family name. Regular briefings on the status of Ashcombe Holdings would be entirely appropriate. Documented updates on sales, transfers, contract renegotiations." She moved closer, her voice dropping. "And if during those briefings you happen to mention irregularities or questionable decisions, well, a wife should understand what her husband is doing with her father's legacy, don't you think?" Harrison was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. "Regular briefings would be appropriate. I can prepare detailed reports on all transactions since the marriage." "Weekly reports," Vivian specified. "Comprehensive and documented. Delivered here, directly to me. My husband need not be informed. We wouldn't want to burden him with minor administrative details while he's occupied with Parliament." "Of course not." Harrison stood, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked less defeated. "Lady Ravenshade, your father would be proud of you." "No, he wouldn't." Vivian's laugh was bitter. "My father would be horrified that I was foolish enough to get into this situation. But perhaps he'd respect what I'm planning to do about it." After Harrison left, Vivian sat alone in the drawing room for a long time, staring at nothing, thinking about everything. She was building something now. Not just gathering information, but constructing the framework for actual action. It would take time, required patience she wasn't sure she possessed. But for the first time since her disastrous wedding night, Vivian felt something besides helpless rage. She felt dangerous. And in the world of aristocratic power games where women were expected to be decorative and silent, dangerous women were the ones who survived, the ones who won. Vivian stood and smoothed her dress, checking her reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. She looked composed, elegant, utterly harmless. Perfect. Let Cedric continue believing he'd already won. Let him enjoy his mistress and his political maneuvering in the capital while his wife sat home playing Duchess. By the time he realized what she was actually doing, it would already be too late to stop her. The war had begun. And this time, when someone's world burned, it wouldn't be Vivian Ashcomb's. The first report from Harrison arrived exactly 1 week after their meeting, delivered by a nervous courier who handed Vivian a sealed envelope and departed without meeting her eyes. She waited until she was alone in her private sitting room before breaking the wax seal, her hands steady despite the acceleration of her pulse. The contents were devastating in their thoroughness. Harrison had documented everything. Every property sale, every contract renegotiation, every strategic dismantling of her father's carefully constructed empire. Cedric had moved quickly, ruthlessly efficient in his asset stripping. 3 warehouses sold at below market value to buyers who turned out to be his political allies. 4 shipping contracts terminated and renegotiated under terms that funneled profits directly into Ravenshade accounts. A textile factory her father had spent 15 years building, liquidated completely to pay off Cedric's gambling debts from before their marriage. The numbers swam before her eyes. Millions of pounds of value evaporated in 3 months. Her father's legacy, reduced to cash that Cedric was using to finance his political ambitions and maintain his lifestyle. Vivian set down the papers and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. The gardens below were empty, winter-bare trees casting skeletal shadows across frozen ground. She focused on her breathing, forcing air in and out of lungs that felt suddenly too small. This was bigger than personal betrayal. Cedric wasn't just using her, he was systematically destroying everything her father had built from nothing. Every risk her father had taken, every sacrifice, every brilliant strategic move that had elevated the Ashcombe name from obscurity to prominence, all of it being erased to fund the ambitions of a man who'd never built anything himself. The rage that filled her wasn't hot anymore. It had crystallized into something cold and patient and absolutely implacable. Cedric thought he was untouchable, protected by law and social convention and the inherent powerlessness of wives in aristocratic marriages. He'd calculated that Vivian would accept her fate because she had no alternative. He'd miscalculated catastrophically. Vivian returned to the desk and began making notes in her personal cipher, cross-referencing Harrison's report with the information she'd already gathered from Cedric's private papers, building a timeline, identifying patterns, looking for vulnerabilities. Because everyone had vulnerabilities. Even powerful dukes playing games with other people's lives. The trick was finding them before they destroyed you completely. 3 days later, she attended another of Lady Catherine's gatherings, this time a charity auction for hospital funding. The event was crowded with aristocrats displaying their wealth through competitive bidding on items nobody actually needed. Vivian wore emerald green, a color Eleanor had deemed too bold, but which made Vivian's skin glow and drew eyes as she moved through the crowd. She bid on nothing. Simply observed, cataloged, listened to conversations happening in corners where people thought they had privacy. Aristocrats loved to gossip, and if you stayed quiet enough, they forgot you were there. Near the refreshment table, she overheard Lord Pembroke talking to another nobleman. Their voices low, but not quite low enough. Cedric's getting desperate. The parliamentary vote on the trade regulation bill is next month. If it fails, his entire strategy collapses. He's leveraged everything on that passing. The other man sounded worried. If it doesn't, the creditors will come calling. Then he'd better make sure it passes. Pembroke's laugh was sharp. Though between you and me, Adrian Vale has enough votes lined up to block it. Cedric doesn't know that yet, but he will soon enough. Vivian's heart rate spiked. She carefully selected a petit four from the dessert display, her expression showing nothing while her mind raced. Cedric had bet everything on legislation that was about to fail, which meant his financial house of cards was about to collapse unless he found another source of funds, which meant he'd strip her father's businesses even faster, more ruthlessly, selling off anything with value to cover his debts. She needed to move faster, needed to find leverage before there was nothing left to salvage. Adrian Vale stood on the opposite side of the room, talking to Lady Margaret with that sardonic smile he wore like armor. Vivian studied him, remembering Cedric's warnings about how dangerous he was, how he shouldn't be trusted, which made him exactly the kind of person she needed to approach. She waited until he was alone, standing near the auction display, examining a supposedly rare manuscript with obvious skepticism. Then she moved beside him with the calculated casualness of someone who just happened to be looking at the same item. Overpriced and probably a forgery, she said quietly, her eyes on the manuscript rather than him. Adrian glanced at her, eyebrows raising slightly. Most people wouldn't recognize that. You have an eye for authenticity. My father collected rare documents. He taught me how to identify counterfeits. The paper's wrong, the ink too uniform. Real aged manuscripts have inconsistencies. Fascinating. Adrian's attention was fully on her now, that sharp intelligence assessing. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was. Vivian kept her voice steady despite the grief that still ambushed her in unexpected moments. He built something real, something that mattered. And now? Now it's being dismantled by someone who doesn't understand the difference between wealth and value. She finally looked at Adrian directly. But I imagine you already knew that, Lord Vale. You seem to make it your business to know things that others would prefer kept private. Adrian studied her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was pitched for her ears alone. Your husband has made enemies, Lady Ravenshade, powerful ones who would enjoy seeing him fail spectacularly. I'm aware. Vivian held his gaze. The question is whether those enemies would be interested in information that could facilitate such a failure. That would depend on the information, and on what the provider wanted in exchange. What if the provider wanted nothing except to watch someone who deserved consequences finally receive them? Adrian's smile turned genuine, sharp as broken glass. Then I'd say that provider sounds dangerously intelligent, the kind of person who might find herself in considerable trouble if she's not extremely careful. I've been in trouble since I signed my marriage contract. Vivian's voice was flat. The only question now is whether I drown quietly or take someone down with me. Before Adrian could respond, Lady Catherine materialized beside them, her timing too perfect to be accidental. Lord Vale, Lady Ravenshade, how delightful to see you both examining the auction items. Have either of you found anything worth bidding on? I'm afraid not. Adrian's expression shifted back to polite neutrality. Though the conversation has been more valuable than any manuscript. He bowed slightly to both women and moved away, leaving Vivian alone with Catherine. The older woman waited until he was out of earshot before speaking. That was either very brave or spectacularly foolish, my dear. Adrian Vale is not a man to approach lightly. I'm aware of his reputation. Vivian turned to face Catherine directly. But I find myself in a position where caution feels like a slower form of suicide. Catherine's eyes narrowed. What exactly has Cedric done? Besides marry me for my inheritance and immediately begin dismantling my father's life work while maintaining a mistress, he makes no real effort to hide. Vivian kept her voice conversational, but steel ran through every word. He's betting everything on parliamentary legislation that's about to fail. When it does, he'll accelerate selling off Ashcombe assets to cover his debts. Within 6 months, there will be nothing left of what my father built. And you want revenge. I want justice. Vivian met Catherine's calculating gaze. There's a difference. Revenge is emotional. Justice is strategic. I want Cedric to face actual consequences for what he's done. Not just to me, but to everyone he's manipulated and used. Catherine was silent for a long moment, studying Vivian with new appreciation. You're more like your father than anyone realized. He had that same quality, that ability to separate emotion from strategy even when fury was eating him alive. You knew him? We did business together years ago. Catherine's smile was reminiscent. Before he became so successful that aristocrats felt threatened by him. He was brilliant and ruthless and completely committed to building something that would outlast him. He loved you very much, you know. Talked about you constantly. How proud he was of your intelligence. The words hit Vivian like a physical blow. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for the grief that surged up from wherever she'd buried it. Her throat tightened and she blinked rapidly, refusing to cry in public. Catherine's expression softened marginally. Your father would not want you destroyed by Cedric's ambitions, but he'd also caution you to be smarter than your enemy, more patient, more strategic. Can you do that? Vivian forced herself to breathe, to regain control. I don't know, but I'm going to try. Then let me give you some advice. Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Adrian Vale is dangerous, but he's also honorable in his own way. If you're going to feed him information about Cedric, make sure it's documented and verifiable. Adrian won't act on rumor or emotion. He needs evidence solid enough to use in Parliament without it reflecting badly on him. She paused, then added, "And be very careful about timing. If you move too soon, Cedric will crush you. Too late. And there will be nothing left to salvage. The window for this kind of operation is narrow and unforgiving. I understand. Do you?" Catherine's gaze was piercing. Because once you start down this path, there's no returning to being the innocent victim. You become a player in the game, and players who lose don't get second chances. They get destroyed completely. "Then I'd better make sure I don't lose." Catherine studied her for another moment, then smiled. "Welcome to the real aristocracy, Lady Ravenshade. The version that exists behind the pretty facades and polite conversation. Try not to get devoured too quickly. I'm starting to like you." She moved away to greet other guests, leaving Vivian standing alone beside the forged manuscript. Around her, the auction continued, wealthy people bidding ridiculous amounts on worthless items, everyone playing their roles in the elaborate theater of aristocratic society. But beneath the surface, in the shadows where real power moved, Vivian had just taken her first actual step toward war. She'd identified a potential ally, learned valuable intelligence about Cedric's vulnerabilities, and received something she hadn't expected. Validation that what she was planning wasn't just emotional revenge, but strategic necessity. The knowledge settled into her bones like armor. That night, alone in the master bedroom that had never felt like home, Vivian drafted her first real communication to Adrian Vale. Not a letter, too dangerous to have documented. Instead, she prepared a packet of information copied from Harrison's reports and Cedric's private papers. Financial documents showing the systematic asset stripping, contracts demonstrating the below-market sales to Cedric's political allies, evidence of loans taken against her father's properties without proper authorization. She arranged for delivery through a trusted servant, one of the older staff who'd served her father and who'd made clear his loyalty remained with the Ashcombe name. The packet would reach Adrian anonymously, giving him material to investigate without directly implicating her. It was a small move, one piece on a very large board, but it was more than she'd had before. Progress measured in inches when you were swimming through miles of water trying not to drown. 2 weeks passed. Vivian maintained her routine of social obligations and quiet research, gathering more information, building her understanding of the intricate web of debts and obligations that governed aristocratic power structures. Harrison's weekly reports continued arriving, each one documenting further destruction of her father's legacy. Then Cedric returned from the capital. He arrived late on a Thursday evening, his carriage clattering into the courtyard while Vivian was preparing for bed. She heard the commotion downstairs, heard his voice giving sharp orders to servants, heard the heavy tread of his boots on the stairs. She stood in the center of the bedroom wearing her nightgown and wrapper, hands folded calmly in front of her, and waited. The door opened without knocking. Cedric filled the doorframe, his expression thunderous. Behind him, Vivian could see servants hovering nervously in the hallway before he slammed the door shut. "We need to talk." His voice was controlled, but fury radiated from every line of his body. "Welcome home." Vivian kept her tone neutral. "I trust your time in the capital was productive." "Don't!" Cedric crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Whatever game you think you're playing, it stops now. I'm not sure what you mean. Someone's been feeding Adrian Vale information about my financial dealings. Detailed information about property sales and contract renegotiations. Information that could only have come from private family records." Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression blank. "That sounds concerning. Have you identified the source?" "I know it's you." Cedric's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "No one else has access to those documents. No one else would have reason to undermine me. I'm your wife. What possible reason would I have to damage your political position?" Vivian held his gaze steadily. "My reputation is tied to yours. If you fail, I suffer the social consequences as much as you do." "Exactly. Which is why this makes no sense unless you're either incredibly stupid or actively trying to destroy us both." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "So which is it, Vivian? Are you an idiot who doesn't understand what she's doing? Or are you deliberately sabotaging the man who saved you from financial ruin?" The accusation was so backwards, so completely inverted from reality, that Vivian almost laughed. Almost. But she caught herself, recognizing the danger in this moment. Cedric was cornered, reactive, capable of violence if pushed too far. She needed to diffuse this carefully. I haven't shared any information with anyone. Vivian kept her voice steady, reasonable. But if Lord Vale has obtained financial documents, perhaps you should examine your own security. How many people have access to your study? Your private papers? Could one of your political rivals have bribed a servant? She watched the idea take root, saw Cedric's certainty waver slightly. He wanted to believe she was guilty, but he also needed to believe his own security was better than it apparently was. You're saying someone in this household is betraying me? I'm saying I have no reason to undermine you, and no access to the kind of detailed financial information Lord Vale apparently possesses. Unless you think I've been sneaking into your study at night and copying documents? Vivian allowed a hint of sarcasm to enter her voice. I'm your wife, Cedric. Not a spy. The sarcasm was a calculated risk. Guilty people stayed defensive. Innocent people got irritated when repeatedly accused. Cedric studied her face, searching for tells. Vivian gave him nothing but mild annoyance and genuine confusion. Finally, he stepped back. If I find out you're lying, there will be consequences. Severe ones. Do you understand? I understand that you're under stress and looking for someone to blame. Vivian moved past him toward the bed. But accusing me won't solve your actual problem, which is that someone with access to your private affairs is working against you. I suggest you focus on identifying the real source rather than attacking the only person in this house who has no power to hurt you. She climbed into bed and pulled the covers up, dismissing him with body language. Cedric stood frozen for a moment, apparently thrown by her calm refusal to continue the confrontation. Then he turned and left without another word, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the frame. Vivian waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway. Then she pressed her hands against her chest, feeling her heart trying to beat out of her ribcage. The fear she'd suppressed during the confrontation flooded through her now, making her shake. He'd been close, so close to certainty. If she'd shown any guilt, any fear, he would have acted on it. Locked her away, cut her off from any contact with the outside world, maybe worse. She'd gambled on his ego, on his need to believe his security was better than it was. And the gamble had worked. This time. But she couldn't count on luck continuing. Cedric was suspicious now. He'd be watching her more carefully, restricting her access, probably interrogating servants. Her window for gathering information and passing it to Adrian was closing rapidly. She needed to accelerate her timeline, needed to move from gathering evidence to actually using it before Cedric shut down all her avenues. The next morning, she sent another message to Adrian through her trusted servant. This time, not just financial documents, but names. The political allies Cedric had bribed with underpriced properties. The creditors he was avoiding. The legislation he'd bet everything on that Adrian was apparently planning to block. And included with it all, a simple note. The vote happens in 3 weeks. After that, he'll be desperate. Desperate men make mistakes. Make sure those mistakes are public. No signature, no identification. But Adrian would understand where it came from. Vivian sealed the packet and handed it to the servant, a man named Thomas, who'd served her father for 20 years. He took it without comment, his weathered face showing nothing but steady loyalty. Be careful, Thomas. If you're caught with this, claim you found it and we're bringing it to Lord Ravenshade. Don't protect me. Thomas's mouth tightened. Your father asked me to watch over you if anything happened to him. I failed him by not warning you about Lord Ravenshade's true nature before the wedding. I won't fail him again. He left through the servant's entrance before Vivian could argue. She watched from the window as he disappeared down the road toward the city, carrying information that could either save her or destroy what remained of her life. No middle ground anymore. No safe options. Just the cold calculation of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required becoming exactly as ruthless as your enemies. The 3 weeks that followed were among the most excruciating of Vivian's life. Cedric hovered constantly, his suspicion making him erratic and controlling. He restricted her social calls, questioned every servant who spoke to her, monitored her correspondence. Eleanor increased her supervision as well, apparently instructed by Cedric to watch for any suspicious behavior. Vivian played her role perfectly. Docile, confused by the increased restrictions, slightly hurt, but accepting. She attended the limited social functions Cedric permitted, always accompanied, always monitored. She made no waves, caused no scenes, gave everyone watching exactly what they expected to see. And at night, alone in her room, she waited for news from the capital. The parliamentary vote happened on a Wednesday. Vivian heard about it from Eleanor, who arrived for tea looking oddly satisfied. Cedric's trade regulation bill failed. Eleanor sipped her tea delicately. A significant setback for his political ambitions. Adrian Vale managed to rally enough opposition to block it completely. Vivian kept her expression carefully neutral. That must be disappointing for him. Quite. Eleanor studied her over the rim of her teacup, though perhaps not entirely surprising. Cedric has been overextending himself lately, making enemies faster than he builds allies. Your father used to warn about that, actually. Said the key to lasting success was making sure you had more friends than enemies at any given time. You knew my father well, better than most people realized. Eleanor set down her cup with precise care. We had our disagreements, certainly. He thought the aristocracy was parasitic and obsolete. I thought merchants were vulgar social climbers. But I respected his intelligence. He built something real through actual work rather than inherited privilege. She paused, then added quietly, he wouldn't have wanted this for you. This marriage. If he'd lived long enough to properly investigate Cedric's character, he'd never have allowed the courtship to continue. The admission caught Vivian completely off guard. Eleanor had never shown anything but cold calculation before. This unexpected moment of what might almost be sympathy felt like the ground shifting beneath her feet. Thank you for saying that. Vivian's voice came out rougher than intended. I've wondered sometimes if he'd be disappointed in my choices. He'd be furious with Cedric, not you. Eleanor's expression hardened again. Men like my son see the world as something to be conquered and consumed. They don't understand the difference between acquisition and stewardship. Your father understood that. Built institutions that outlasted individual ambition. She stood, smoothing her skirts. Cedric will be home tomorrow. The bill's failure means his financial situation is now quite precarious. I expect he'll be in a foul mood and likely to make rash decisions. I suggest you stay out of his way for the next few weeks. The warning was clear. Eleanor knew or strongly suspected what Cedric might do when cornered, and she was telling Vivian to protect herself. After Eleanor left, Vivian sat alone in the drawing room trying to process the interaction. Eleanor wasn't an ally, exactly, but she also wasn't entirely Cedric's creature. There were complex loyalties at work, family dynamics Vivian didn't fully understand. But one thing was becoming clear: Cedric was isolated. His mother wouldn't protect him if he went too far. His political allies were abandoning him. His financial structure was collapsing. He was dangerous now in the way cornered animals become dangerous, desperate and reactive and capable of violence. Vivian needed to be ready. Cedric returned the next evening, arriving like a thunderstorm. Vivian heard him in his study, shouting at someone, the sound of breaking glass. She stayed in her sitting room, door locked, and waited. Near midnight, he appeared, having apparently drunk enough to fuel his rage into something more volatile. He pounded on her door until she opened it, then pushed past her into the room. This is your fault. He swayed slightly, whiskey heavy on his breath. You and whatever poison you've been feeding to my enemies. I've done nothing. Vivian kept the locked door at her back, maintaining her escape route. Your bill failed because you didn't have the votes. That has nothing to do with me, liar. The word came out slurred. Adrian Vale had information only you could have provided. Financial details, contract specifics. He stood in Parliament and dismantled my credibility using my own private records. Then someone in your employment betrayed you. Vivian held her ground despite every instinct screaming to run. I've told you repeatedly, I don't have access to your private business affairs. You had access to everything through your father. All those companies, all those contracts. You knew exactly what I was planning to do with them, because you married me specifically to seize them. Vivian's control finally cracked, fury bleeding through. You courted me while my father's body was barely cold, lied about loving me, then stripped away everything he built to fund your political ambitions. And now you're angry because someone exposed what you did? Cedric's face twisted. I saved you from ruin. You created my ruin. Vivian's voice rose. My father's businesses were solvent, profitable. The only crisis was in your finances, and you used my grief and isolation to trap me into solving your problems. Don't you dare pretend you were my savior. The slap came without warning, sharp enough to snap her head sideways. Vivian gasped, hand flying to her cheek, tasting blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. They stared at each other in shocked silence. Cedric looked at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. Then his expression hardened into something cruel. "You don't get to speak to me that way." He moved closer, forcing Vivian back against the door. "I own you. Your name, your property, your future. Everything you are exists because I allow it. And if you've been working against me, I will destroy you so completely that no one will even remember the Ashcombe name existed." His hand closed around her throat, not squeezing, but threatening. Vivian froze, every muscle locked, barely breathing. "Last chance, Vivian. Confess what you've done. Tell me how you've been communicating with Adrian. Give me names and methods. Do that, and maybe I'll be merciful." Vivian met his eyes, seeing the calculation beneath the rage. He wanted her confession, needed it to act against Adrian or whoever else she might have contacted. If she gave him nothing, he had no clear target. If she gave him everything, she had no leverage left. "I have nothing to confess." Her voice came out strangled but steady. "Because I've done nothing except survive being married to a man who never saw me as human." Cedric's hand tightened fractionally. "Then you're either innocent or the most accomplished liar I've ever encountered. And I'm not sure which possibility frightens me more." He released her abruptly and stepped back. "Fine. You want to play innocent? We'll see how long that lasts." He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Vivian heard the distinctive sound of a key turning in the lock from the outside. She was trapped. Vivian slumped against the door, hand still pressed to her bruised throat, and realized with cold clarity that everything had just accelerated beyond her control. Cedric had crossed a line tonight. The violence, the threat, the imprisonment. He'd revealed exactly how far he was willing to go, which meant she had to be willing to go further. She moved to the window and looked out at the dark estate grounds. The distance to the ground was too far to jump safely, but there was a trellis along the exterior wall strong enough to hold climbing roses, maybe strong enough to hold a desperate woman. She couldn't stay locked in this room, couldn't give Cedric time to systematically destroy every connection she'd built, every piece of evidence she'd gathered. Tomorrow he'd probably interrogate the servants, discover Thomas, maybe even harm the old man to extract information. She needed to act tonight. Vivian changed quickly into her darkest dress, pulled on her riding boots, stuffed Harrison's reports and the copies she'd made of Cedric's papers into a leather satchel. Everything she needed to prove what he'd done, everything Adrian would need to finish destroying Cedric's political career. Then she opened the window, cold night air rushing in, and looked down at the trellis. This was insane. If she fell, she'd break bones. If she was caught, Cedric's retribution would be worse than anything she'd experienced so far. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was too risky, too desperate, but the alternative was staying trapped while Cedric systematically eliminated every advantage she'd built. And Vivian Ashcombe had not survived this long by choosing safety over survival. She climbed out the window. The trellis held, barely. It creaked and swayed under her weight, old wood threatening to splinter, but she moved quickly, hands gripping wooden slats, feet finding purchase. Her dress caught on thorns from the dormant rose vines, fabric ripping, skin stinging where thorns drew blood. She didn't stop, didn't look down, just kept climbing until her feet hit solid ground. Then she was riding through the night, the satchel clutched against her chest, cold wind burning her face, and she didn't look back at the prison that had almost consumed her. She rode toward the city, toward Adrian Vale's townhouse, toward the only gamble she had left, because there was no returning from this. No way to walk back into that house and pretend tonight hadn't happened. She'd just transformed from trapped wife to fugitive, from victim to active combatant. The war she'd been planning in careful increments had just become immediate and total. And as Vivian rode through the darkness toward an uncertain future with evidence that could destroy her husband clutched against her chest, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before her father died. Not hope exactly. Hope was too fragile a word for what burned in her chest, but possibility. The savage, terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could win this after all. Even if winning meant losing everything she'd once thought she wanted. Adrian Vale's townhouse stood 3 stories tall on a fashionable street where gaslight reflected off rain-slicked cobblestones like scattered coins. Vivian dismounted in the shadow of the building, her legs barely holding her weight after hours of hard riding. The horse was lathered and trembling, and she felt a surge of guilt for pushing the animal so hard. But guilt was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Silence. Then footsteps inside, the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged man in servant's livery, his expression shifting from annoyance to shock as he took in her appearance. Torn dress, bleeding hands, face bruised where Cedric had struck her. "I need to speak with Lord Vale." Vivian kept her voice steady, despite exhaustion making her sway. "Tell him Lady Ravenshade is here with information he's been waiting for." The servant's eyes widened. "My lady, perhaps you should wait while I fetch a physician." "No physicians, just Lord Vale." "Please." The servant hesitated, then gestured her inside. The entrance hall was elegant but understated, reflecting Adrian's political position rather than inherited wealth. Vivian stood dripping on expensive carpet while the servant disappeared up the stairs.